It's the summary of the book of Joshua today, which was short and not particularly sweet, as it was all pretty much about war. And I'm sort of stuck with the problem. I can't quite decide if Joshua was okay or if he was a bit of a punk. Just kind of a brief catch-up in terms of the books we've covered already, and so we can put Joshua in context with those. We've had the book of Genesis, which was basically people are crap, but necessarily so. We've had the book of Exodus, which is basically God is the boss, be excellent to each other. This is all as far as I can tell. The book of Leviticus, which was very boring, seems to be about how to manage a sinful nature. The book of Numbers, which seems to be about the consequences of what happens if you don't do as you're told. The book of Deuteronomy, which is a bit of a rehash of the last three and just adds a bit more detail. And then the book of Joshua, which seems, for me, the main takeaway from it is that it seems to establish that the invasion of the Promised Land wasn't genocide, albeit there are still some problems that come with it. And in that respect, I don't think it's as significant, perhaps, as Genesis, Leviticus and Numbers. But it's still very useful context, I think, actually. And it's, again, helping to bring the whole thing together. Briefly, in terms of the historical validity of this, I have had a look at, and I can't see anything that particularly suggests that this is widely supported in terms of historical evidence. I mean, granted, it's 3,000 years ago, so that's not unreasonable. I gather at this point there are some references in Egypt to a people called Israel living in the land of Canaan. There also sounds like there's evidence of altars that have been found around this sort of period, so it does sound like A, there were Israelites in Canaan at this point, and B, that some sort of transition in terms of religious practice took place. I don't think that particularly helps in terms of this. It would be nice to find some walls of Jericho falling down, wouldn't it? But I mean, to be fair, that's probably unlikely that you would find that anywhere, I think. So, not conclusive yet at this point in terms of history, but it does seem like we are moving forward to where we might have a chance of having something corroborated by historians. This reminds me, actually, because I stumbled across the word historicity in some sort of Christian debate about whether things were valid. And I had a little giggle to myself because I thought that's a very funny little made-up word. Googled it. No, apparently it's actually a word. So I have to apologise to whoever that was I giggled at, even though they were on YouTube. But yeah, so historicity, despite sounding like a completely made-up word, is actually a word. Then we can actually assess the historicity of these stories. That being said, whether or not we can establish the historicity of these stories in detail, and obviously we can't. I don't think that matters anyway. Sure, it would if it actually was true that a bunch of people marched around a big city, yelled at it, and the walls fell over. That would seem like, okay, yeah, maybe there's something to that. But we can't know that one way or another, so I'm not going to waste time on that, and we'll move on from there. There's also the overwhelming number of examples where people are clearly speaking metaphorically. For example, there's references in these stories to people being wiped out who then turn up again later. It would seem more likely that it's just telling a big old flowery story rather than saying, oh, this and oh no, I've contradicted myself later on, because that would be so obvious that they've done that. So, and everyone seems to speak metaphorically, including God. So it seems that just is part of the way it's done at that time. I'm thinking, therefore, that all this stuff at the minute is still all about just context for what's going to come later on, which hopefully there's some proof of the pudding will be there in terms of something we can really get into in terms of assessing whether this stuff might be true or not. It is tricky, this non-literal language thing, though, because it makes it sound very convenient to say, well, they said that, but they didn't mean it. And, you know, you could look at that as a contradiction. 1 minute they're saying this thing, the next minute they're saying another thing. But I think, as I've made the point before, I can't remember one of the videos, about you have to some extent read between the lines, as you do with everything. A good example of that is I was reading something recently about pensions, as you do, and it was talking about the problems, the challenges in the markets because of government changing in the UK and all that every 5 minutes. And the article makes the comment that we've had more cabinet reshuffles than hot dinners in the last few years. I guess we see these sort of things all the time, but that one actually suddenly struck me and suddenly thinking, yeah, fast forward 3,000 years from here, read that back, and historians are looking at that going, blimey, they had a lot of cabinet reshuffles, didn't they? There's one a day or two a day, whatever. So we do still do it now. The principle stands, even in modern times, that people do say things that aren't literally true and they're more figure of speech. A fun example I thought of was, there's this, it's back in Deuteronomy actually, but it doesn't matter for these purposes. There's a line that says, Moses speaks to all of Israel. So the census established 600,000-ish people, but that was only men of fighting age. So there's probably around about 1 million people, but I mean, there's a minimum of 600,000 at least, let's say. Back in 2017, I was at the O2 watching a Metallica concert the day they broke the record for attendance there with, I think it was 22,211 people. So I was towards the back. I probably can't even make out from that where the stage is or anybody who's on it. And that's only 22,000 people. I wouldn't have had a hope of hearing someone on that stage without a PA system. Very loud PA system. And then we're talking about Moses addressing a crowd that's at least 30 times larger than that. So there's just no way. It's obviously not literally true. So I think to suggest that the writer was trying to claim it was literally true would be a bit lazy in terms of making argument. I think, therefore, we can reasonably deduce that a lot of these statements are not even intended to be taken literally and are just intended to convey an idea. I'm mindful, of course, that there is a fine line between exaggerated, flowery language about the glories of war and all the rest of it versus just lying to deceive. We've got to be careful of that. And it's also true, of course, that even if it's not literally true, they wiped out everybody, they still went in there and they took over the Promised Land, and they definitely killed a lot of people, and some women and children and innocent people would have definitely been among those. Either way, therefore, literal language or not, that still leaves us with a problem we have to contend with. There was a remarkably bold conversation I saw on YouTube recently between a Christian philosopher, William Lane Craig, and an atheist, Alex O'Connor, talking about some really difficult stuff. I have to admit, I do take my hat off to William Lane Craig for having the balls to make the argument in a public forum that it's okay for God to move children onto the afterlife through the mechanism of an Israelite invasion and basically a massacre. The bottom line, though, if William Lane Craig is right, the Bible is true and God exists, then he's got a reasonable argument, I think. Granted, a very difficult one to stomach, and one that's not going to go down well at all with a lot of people who are going to immediately misinterpret what he's saying. But ultimately, if God is picking up people from this life and fast-forwarding them to heaven, especially given the idea that life is basically suffering, which is, it's broadly true, no one has a completely comfortable life, so there could be some virtue in being accelerated from one state to the next, then you could at least make an argument that genocide brought about by God could potentially actually be reasonable and okay. An obvious issue with this that Alex actually raised in the interview is that, okay, how do you know that God actually told you to do that? An example being 9/11, of course. You've got people who clearly thought that God had told them to smash aeroplanes into things. And even if God does exist, I'm pretty sure he didn't tell them to do that. But of course, this is all part of a story where the Israelites saw the splitting of the Red Sea and plague, or actually, granted, all this are a different lot, aren't they? But their parents all saw that. So it's all been passed down with very short distance in time between massive events and the rest of it. I believe they will have all seen the manna from heaven type thing. They've seen water from rocks. They've seen the glory of God. They've seen the river at Jordan blocked up by the Ark of the Covenant. They've seen the walls of Jericho fall down. So, I mean, they have seen a lot of stuff that we haven't seen, which is incomprehensible to us in terms of the natural phenomenon that everyone's observed in the last 2,000 years, as far as I'm aware. But it would need to be that level of evidence, because it doesn't matter how vivid a dream is. I'm not going to wake up in the morning and go and invade my neighbour's house. It's just... there's nothing's going to convince me that God told me to do that. But if this story is true, then these Israelites have seen an awful lot of stuff that would be pretty compelling in terms of, okay, yeah, this guy probably is real, better do as I'm told. There's an interesting distinction there, of course, because what God has done is he's got the Israelites to go and kill all these Canaanites because they're worshipping Baal and setting fire to children and stuff. And in the process of sorting that out, he's basically achieved the same thing. Like, a lot of these people have died. So this would seem to clearly highlight that it matters whether God has commanded it or if someone has just chosen to do it off their own back. And that distinction is clearly critical. That, I guess, also ties back to, in a mini way, to that Achan guy who stole the nice small Babylonian robe and took it back to his tent. At the point he nicked that, God had said, don't loot stuff from the towns you're conquering, the next town they conquered, they were allowed to. So Akan was put to death for doing something that in the next invasion everyone was doing anyway, and the difference was just that God said you mustn't do it on the first one, and he said you can do it on the second one. So there's a big point under there all there, I think, in terms of it matters what God says you should do, almost regardless of whether on our own merit we would decide whether it was right or wrong. Tricky one. Pulling it all together anyway, I think we've got sort of 4 main points that come out of this. So we've got point 1, the Israelites didn't actually kill everyone, even though it's blatantly stated that they did. Whoever wrote this book, I presume Joshua, maybe not, I don't know, who cares, doesn't matter. They clearly didn't intend to actually state that they did, because they've blatantly contradicted themselves, and it's clearly done in such a way of similar to more governments than hot dinners. The societies wiped out were clearly, in general, absolutely appalling, because it's just not okay to set fire to children, even when they're really annoying. And if God exists, then potentially fast-forwarding people from an early state of life in this life to heaven is potentially a merciful outcome. Overall, a lot of the objection to this stuff, I think, has to derive from a start point where you assume that God doesn't exist. Because if God doesn't exist, then you can't go around doing whatever you like and saying, because God told me to do it, because that just makes you a punk. But of course, the point of this exercise is I'm trying to approach it with an open mind. So, yeah, sure, if God doesn't exist, people doing that, punks. If God does exist, though, which we still need to establish, and we've got to be open to the possibility, then all of this so far is, well, it's still difficult, isn't it? But it would be reasonable, and it could make some sense. The book of Joshua, therefore, adds a useful component in terms of some context for reaching that conclusion, I think. Or maybe I could have reached that earlier, I don't know. This is just a journey. I've reached that through reading the book of Joshua anyway. And somewhere else later on we need to establish if God actually exists. Because if he does, then Joshua is fine. But if he doesn't, then Joshua is a total punk with a really weird fetish for putting dead people on poles.